Akabor, and welcome to another live stream of the Orisa, the IFA Orisa Community Discussion Program. Today, we were scheduled to have a discussion on the community, building a sustainable community. However, we would not be discussing that today. Today's program is going to be a history of the African people and the Orisa community of Trinidad and Tobago. All right. And as usual, before I get into today's subject, I would open with an Oriki, and then I would read an Odu, an essay Ifa from one of the Odus. All right. Ope ni fun olorun, oludamare oba ajiki. Mojiloni, morogumeriaye, iba ila orun, iba iwo orun, iba ariwa, iba gusu, iba oba igba aye, iba orun oke, iba baba, iba yeye, iba atiwo orun, iba she igungun kiki igungun, iba she ori inu, ipori atiwo orun. Ofi opa otututu kan lesi kana arona. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Today's essay Ifa, or Odu, is going to be taken from Oyeku Ogunda. All right, and I'm reading this one from Ifism Volume 3, and the Odu is Oyeku Meiji. All right, so I'm going to read one of the essays from Oyeku Ogunda, or Oyeku Ijomoda Aye, or Oyeku Doja. All right. Oju ugu ye fon, otikuleyin, adifa fun ita, abo fun awi igbon, ebo ija ki amaja, ki ayiwa le toro. Meaning, the face of the vulture bulges forward, and his stomach protrudes backward. That was the Abo who made divination for Ita, the doubting Thomas, or argumentator. He also made divination for the man who did not listen to advice. They were both told to make sacrifice to avoid quarrel, so that their lives might settle and be peaceful. They made sacrifice, therefore they were able to live a successful life. When this Odu comes out at divination, the man should be told that he is very argumentative and that he also has a close relation, friend, wife, son or daughter who is equally indomitable, because the person does not heed advice. If he can identify the person, they should both make sacrifice in order to get along. Otherwise, there is no way that a person who is argumentative can live successfully with an associate who does not listen to advice. All right. And with that, we're going to get straight into today's discussion. And it is going to be about the history of African people. All right. And I say African people for the simple reason that the Orisa community, the Ifa community, the Ifa Orisa community in Trinidad and Tobago is comprised mainly of descendants from Yoruba but also other groups and subgroups of West African that were brought here. Some as slaves and others came as free Africans. All right. Other groups, some of them I would actually read about today during the lesson, right? But among the groups, we have the Igbos, we have the Yoruba, and we had several other groups that also came. So today, what I'm going to do, I want to get into some important history. And the reason I want to get into the important history is because there has been a lot of discussion and contention recently concerning what our ancestors practiced. All right. Normally, the series that I'm doing right now was a series where I was providing information concerning the imposition of Christianity and the Christian beliefs, and the fact that most of the Africans who came as free people, as well as mature adults, had an understanding of the tradition that they practiced before they arrived in Trinidad. All right. So today, I'm going to look at the overall history. I'm going to look at some of the developments, not just in the history of the religion, but in some cases of ordinances, laws, and some of the varying aspects that African lives have influenced in the history of Trinidad. All right. The first part that I'm going to deal with here is we know that this region was occupied by indigenous American people. The term that is generally used is Amerindian. Okay, Amerindian is actually a abbreviated form of saying American Indian. Okay, so what they do is they drop off the can part of American and they just put Ama and then they put Indian. Okay, so the word Amerindian is an abbreviated form of saying American Indian. Now, these were the indigenous people who lived in Trinidad and Tobago and in other parts of the Caribbean. But today we're dealing primarily with Trinidad. All right. And during the course of the history presentation, I'm going to mention two of the main groups of American Indians that were here initially. All right. It is believed by some historians that there were also people like us who were Americans. All right. But that, of course, would be a lesson for another discussion. So I'm going to start with the history of Trinidad, starting with the expulsion of the Moors from Spain in 1555. Many of the Moors who were expelled from Spain, where they ruled for 1186 years, settled the Caribbean. Not just Trinidad, but also in other Caribbean islands. All right. Many of the old historical buildings in Trinidad, one prime example would be the CID headquarters in Port of Spain that was partially destroyed in 1990. That particular building, the architecture and the raw material that was used to build that building came from Spain. Many people wonder, why is the capital of Trinidad called Port of Spain? It's called Port of Spain because a lot of the raw material that was used and a lot of the imports that was brought to this country after 1555 was imported from Spain. Why? Because many of the people here came from there. And they maintained trade in order to have the supplies of certain building materials as well as refined products and goods that came in from Spain. All right. So whenever you hear the name Port of Spain, understand that there is a connection between the Moors that were expelled in 1555 and came and settled Trinidad as well as other parts of the Caribbean. So the first part of the history, I start at 1555 when the Moors were expelled from Spain and settled the Caribbean, namely Trinidad in this case. Then we have in 1562, we had Pastor John Hawkins, right, who was a British trader who started the trade of human souls, where he brought people first from Sierra Leone to North America, all right, which ushered in the very beginning of the slave trade, all right. Then we move on to 1637, all right, which was the period of the Spanish invasion in Trinidad, okay. Now, the capital of Trinidad in 1637 was St. Joseph, and it was destroyed by the Spaniards. It was burnt to the ground, all right. The chief Hayarima, of course, fight as much as he could have to defend the indigenous American people against the Spaniards. But after the capital was destroyed, they took control and basically they resettled the indigenous people into different parts of Trinidad. Many of them at that point in time then became labor to help the Spanish people develop the colony that they claimed for the king and queen of Spain. All right. Now, the groups that were here, which I mentioned earlier, were the Nipoyo and a group that the Europeans labeled the Arawak. The actual name of this group is the Arikagua, right? From whose name came the name Aruka and Tacarigua. All right. Now, this show especially is for the youths in the community. If you know any youths, let them take in this show and make notes of our history right here in Trinidad. All right, so we're moving forward. In 1773, because we're moving from 1637. Right, in 1773, the island was not very heavily populated. All right, basically, beside the indigenous people, there were probably 1,000 people, which included colonial prisoners of the British, all right, and they used the word slaves at the time. But the term slaves at that time would have been in reference to political prisoners from England, persons who owed debts, as well as persons who practiced religion that was not accepted by the crown at the time. So basically, all of the people who they captured and they brought to the colony as a prisoner, as a punishment, were basically people who they considered to be either political agitators, religious extremists, and some persons owing debt. So the very, very early part of the history of Trinidad would have incorporated labor of the indigenous people and also labor of those who were brought as prisoners under the colonial authorities. All right. So basically, in 1773, there were 1,000 people, and we're not really including the counting of the native people. We're talking about Spanish, English, these type of people, French, all of the foreigners, the colonizers who came. All right. In 1783, the population was 2,763 persons, right? And in 1773, that would have included 128 whites, 295 free colored persons, 300 slaves and 2,032 Amerindians or American Indians. All right. But by 1783, we had many things happening. All right. For the first time, what we had was many persons coming into Trinidad from the French-speaking islands and the French-speaking Caribbean. All right. On an experiment called the Cedula Population. All right. We had all the French-speaking Creoles coming from the various islands. But under the Cedula Population, there was a bunch of rules. All right. Like, for example, the persons who came had to be Catholic. They had to have an allegiance to the Spanish government. All right. And for the whites that came, they got 32 acres of land. And for every slave that they brought, they got an additional 16 acres that they would have given the slaves at the end of their period of working for them, which was called manumission. All right. The free colored people got 16 acres and half of that amount for every slave that they bring. So the free colored people in Trinidad that came from the French-speaking island, who were Catholics and loyal to the Spanish government, were given 16 acres, and they were given 8 acres for every slave that they brought. All right? So the Cedula population was a great experiment that dramatically increased the population of Trinidad. All right? And that would have been in 1783. Now, interestingly enough, that is what was happening in Trinidad. But at the time in America, the British colonial authorities lose a rebellion that took place in America. So in 1783, also beside the Cedula population, you had the British losing the rebellion in the United States. So therefore, they would have at that time had soldiers and various people who were loyal to the British in America who they needed to move out of America because the revolutionaries took over America. And because the British lost, they would have had to find places for these people to come to. All right. So we're moving on from 1783. The next date of importance here is 1807. Right? In 1807, the British banned slavery by an act of Congress in Britain. However, slavery was still going on here and in other parts of the Americas. But because the British outlawed slavery in Britain, what they resorted to doing is they had naval patrols on the ocean, and they would capture other vessels belonging to the Portuguese and to other groups who were still involved in the slave trade. And when they captured these vessels, what they would do is they would take the slaves that were destined for Brazil and other countries, and Cuba and other countries, and they would bring them into their colony and set them free. So even though slavery was still existing in Trinidad, we would have had from 1817, okay, which is when they banned slavery in England, 1807, sorry, when they banned slavery in England, we would have had persons who they captured on the sea that they brought to Trinidad, which was one of their colonies. They would have also took them to some of their other colonies. All right. So in 1813, there were between 26,000. The population dramatically increased because of all of these persons that was coming in that they captured on the high seas and they brought. The population moved from 26,000 to 37,833. And also we have to account too for the Cedula population that came in. So at that time, Trinidad population was growing quite a bit. All right. And of course, because of that growth, we would have had a lot of economic activity that would have been of benefit to the crown, the colony, the British authorities. All right. Now, on record is one particular ship that they captured with about 26,000 Africans. And on that ship, the record is there. All right. It is in the archive. They actually put out a publication some time ago where they listed the stats concerning that ship that was captured with the 26,000 persons. And it was 42% of the people were from Biafra, which means they would have been Igbos. 4.2% was from Benin, right? Another 16% was from Senegambia. Another 12% was from West Central Africa. 7.2% from Gold Coast, 1.4% from Sierra Leone, and 30.9% unspecified. All right, this information is available through the archive of Trinidad and Tobago. So between 1834 and 1867, right? Now, firstly, I want to mention slavery. The abolition of slavery occurred in Trinidad in around 1836, around 1834. All right. Now, during that time, again, a lot of ships were captured at sea, and a lot of the individuals were brought here. Now, that's one of the activity that was taking place. But we also had a very important thing taking place around that time. We had the central government of Oyo falling apart. And as a result of that, we had a lot of people migrating from West Africa to come to Trinidad as free persons. All right, so we had a huge influx of free persons coming into Trinidad from Africa, bringing their full practice and their full tradition and everything with them. All right, according to Melville Herkowitz, as well as Francis Henry, in the 1830s, the Yoruba woman, now this would be after slavery was abolished, went to the company villages and married the men there, which linked the Orisa practice to the Baptist practice, which introduced the concept of the Shango Baptist religion coming into existence. Now, in 1843, the British Baptist missionary entered Trinidad under an Englishman by the name of George Cowan. All right. So if you've heard of the Cowan Hamilton School, you know who it's named after. All right. The church at the time that was known as the British Baptist Missionary was also known by the name of London Baptist. All right. So with the information above that I just mentioned in the 1830s, after slavery was abolished, the Yoruba women was sent to the companies. Of course, they would have married and interbred with the people who came from the United States, who we all heard about in the company villages that were referred to as the Merikins, right? They came primarily with the Baptist religion. Many of them were Christians in the United States. All right. Now, there were another group of Baptists also who rejected the leadership of foreigners and formed the independent Baptist movement. Right? And there was also a further group in 1890 that basically practiced heavy African tradition, who were referred to as the Candle or the Wayside Baptists, which laid the foundation for later on for the Shouter Baptist or the Spiritual Baptist religion. This is spoken about by Hackshaw in his publication in 1990 and by Gibbs de Pizza in her publication in 1999. All right. After emancipation, 1934, in 1813, the population being 37,833, up till 1901 being a population of 255,148 persons. All right. Between the period of 1839 to 1851, the population of Port of Spain alone moved from 11,700 to 17,000 persons, 17,205. And by the year 1891, the population was well over 33,000, which was 33,782. All right, this is information was provided from de Vertile in his document in 1858. All right, he also described Trinidad population as being made up of Congolese, Yorubas, crewmen from Africa, coolies and Chinese from Asia, Americans from the US, Spaniards from Venezuela, immigrants from the British and French colonies, with a limited number of natives of Trinidad. All right. By 1853 or later, the known Yoruba villages that were settled were Caratal, Carapachima, Gasparillo, Oropuch, Princestown, 3rd Company and 5th Company villages, Claxton Bay, Couva, Freeport, Aruca, Tunapuna, St. Joseph, Cocorit, Carenage, Piti Valley, Sierra Leone Village, which I believe is St. Helena, Lavantil, and the East Dry River. All right. One of the interesting things I found out from the historian de Vertile is he referred to the Yorubas as Yarihas and Yarabas. All right, but I would go into the history of that in another lesson about the names that our people were called and its association to people in what we call today the Middle Eastern countries like Sudan and Nubia, because it's a very, very interesting history that connects them to the Yorubas. All right. We go now to 1880, where we had the first ban on the playing of African drums. All right. Well, let me just divert a little bit and talk about something that I've read. And I am going to do some reading out of a book titled Obia, Orisa, and the Religious Identity in Trinidad shortly. But I want to talk a little bit because, Trinidad has had a very interesting history with the development of Orisa and African tradition. One of the things has been the involvement of African women in the tradition. All right, women has always played a significant role in being the promoters and the protectors of the tradition. All right, now to mention two particular persons, Ma B from Couva and Ma Diamond from 5th Company, who, when interviewed by historians, gave the information explaining that their grandmothers settled in Trinidad as free persons from West Africa, from Nigeria namely, and were Yorubas. This is on historical records. All right. They were descendants of liberated Africans who came as free persons in the 19th century. All right. The historian by the name of Henry, in one of his publications in 2008, mentioned that fact from interviews conducted with the two individuals while they were alive. All right. In 1880, going back to the history now, in 1880, the drums were banned by an ordinance in Trinidad. All right. Following the banning of the drum were the Cambule riots in 1881. Now, most of the historical records that speak of the Cambule riots speak of it in Port of Spain. De Vertile gives a full account of everything that happened with the colonial police clashes with the groups of persons in Port of Spain. But there were also smaller sub-riots that took place in Aruca and in other little villages and communities that not much is heard of, but there are landmarks in the places where people lost their lives during the Cambule riot, not just in Port of Spain, but in Aruca also. And there may have been a couple of other places. After the Cambule riot in 1881, we had the Husse riots in Princestown in 1884. All right. Now, the masses of people in Trinidad who celebrated their traditions were very much subjugated by the colonial authorities because they did not really want the people to take to the street with fear of rebellion and reprisal and all of this stuff. So in most instances, what they did is they passed a lot of ordinance to prevent a lot of the assembling of groups of people. All right. So the Jose riot would have been as a result too of laws that prohibited persons from having the ability to celebrate their festivals. All right. We moving now from 1884 to 1917, where the Shelter Prohibition Ordinance was introduced in November 16th of 1917. In 1934, the Tambu Bambu was banned. Now, it's interesting to note that after the African drums were banned, that Africans wanting to take to the street to celebrate, what they did is they created the Tambu Bambu in order to have musical accompaniments for their parades and their procession and their festivities. So after the drum was banned, when they were innovative enough to create the Tambu Bambu, that too was banned in the year 1934. All right. Now around 1934, right, basically because of the banning of the Tambu Bambu, that was actually the period when the pan became invented. So with each ban came innovativity of African people to create things that they needed in order to have their festivals and their activities. So pan actually started. So around that time, you would have had things like the Fancy Sailor, and you would have had bands like the Bad Behavior Band coming into existence around 1934. You would have also had places like the Helliard, which was a group. You would have had the Merry Boys. You would have had the Lavantil Boys, and you would have had River Lady. And these groups that had their Fancy Sailor bands and had their yards that was associated heavily with the rhythm section and the pan yards later on metamorphosized into some of the large bands that we have today. Many of those that played in a band that was called the Trinidad All-Star Percussion Orchestra, or TASPO, later on became captains of many of the popular large steel bands in Trinidad and Tobago. All right, but let me go back to reading. All right, so 1945 would have been the Red Army Steel Band. 1949, right, would have been the legal incorporation of the West Indian United Baptist Order on November 4th. So while we were having things happening culturally, the source of the culture has always been our spirituality. So we always had parallel to cultural development. We also had spiritual development and progress being made in the spiritual arena also. So we had the legal incorporation of the West Indian United Baptist Order on November 4th. In 1950s, we had the Merikins, which would have been a pan side also. All right. Now, in 1950, we had an important occurrence, particularly with the United Baptists. We had Bishop Griffith, or Bishop Griffith Elder, becoming the bishop in December 29, 1950. All right. Now, because of a lot of these developments, not just culturally and on the religious scene, Africans have always had to fight and struggle with the colonial authority through legal means to push forward to have recognition, whether it be as a cultural entity or as a religious entity. So this particular act of Elder Griffith becoming a bishop was a major advancement for African spirituality, even under the name of Baptist. All right? Because again, most of the mainstream religions, including the London Baptists, did not really accept African people who practice in African tradition to be fully Baptist. So when people would be catching power and having manifestation, they did not like that. So they made it their business to separate themselves from it, and by all means to try to subjugate it from getting mainstream acceptance. So in 1969, we had 1951, we had the repeal of the Shelter Baptist Prohibition Ordinance. This came a year after the election of Bishop Griffith in 1950 on December 29. So we know that we had persons who worked very hard, including Bishop Griffith, to bring about the type of changes that would have pushed for the repeal of the Shelter Baptist Prohibition Ordinance. All right. Now, around that time, around 1951, moving quickly towards the 70s, we had a re-emergence of African awareness and Black consciousness. For the first time in the history of Trinidad, a Calypso monarch was made of the mighty Duke for having a song called Black is Beautiful. That would have been in 1969. Many of the young people who on this stream would have heard people talking about Black power. All right? That was because the awareness and the Afrocentric consciousness of our people was moving up to a very high point and a high level. It was not only happening in Trinidad at the time, it was happening in England, it was happening in America with the Black Panthers. Trinidad had its own version of the same. It was referred to as the Black Power. In 1970, there was a 56 days of Black Power protest from February to April of the year 1970. All right. This is very, very important history. This is a very important piece of history that every African in Trinidad needs to know, particularly the young people, because you must know of the sacrifices that our elders has made for us to be in the current position that we are in today. All right. Now, April 23rd of 1970, not only was there a struggle on the front of the general African population with the 56 days of Black Power protest. On the religious front, the Yoruba or the Orisa community was also struggling with the IRSC, which was the forerunner to the IRO, which is the Interreligious Organization, to have the Orisa community accepted in the Interreligious Organization as a religion. That was also a place that we also had to struggle to get that level of recognition. So that would have been the 70s. Moving forward now to 1981. In 1981, something very important happened for African people and for the Orisa community. In 1981, by an act of parliament, Act number 35, there was the incorporation of the Orisa movement of Trinidad and Tobago. The name of the organization was the Egbe Orisa Ilewa. This was done on the 9th of September, 1981. The individual who registered or who was incorporated as the head of the organization was Orisa Iya Melvina Rodney. This marked a major point in the history of the Orisa community development. So this is a point that all members of our community, not just the Orisa community, but all African people in Trinidad must make a note of. Youths, for you especially, take record of this. That was the first time that under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture, for the Orisa community, that the Orisa community was empowered. One, for the development of archival material, written, audio, and visual, to document the history and the practice of the tradition. Two, to devise an educational curriculum to teach the West African Yoruba language. And three, to invite indigenous Yoruba to another important activity that took place. We had a visit of the spiritual head of the Yoruba people, the Oni Okunade Shijuwade Olubose II, visiting from August 1st to August 8th in 1988. All right. On that visit, the Oni appointed Iya Melvina Rodney and gave her the authorization to be in charge of Orisa affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. After this, in 1988, the next important thing that happened is we had another Orisa group by an act of parliament, Act number 27, having their organization incorporated. The incorporation of the Orisa religion, and this Orisa is spelled Orisha, which is different from the one that was done in 1981 under the Parliament Act 35. That one was incorporated of the Orisa, O-R-I-S-A, movement of Trinidad, okay, which was Egbe Orisa Ilewa, Orisa spelled O-R-I-S-A. This one now was the Orisa, O-R-I-S-H-A, religion, which was registered under the name Opa Orisa Shango. This was done on the 29th of August in 1991. All right, the persons under whose name this organization was incorporated was Babal Orisha Clarence Ford and E.L. Orisha Dr. Molly Ihe. All right, now let me go through the history. Let me finish off the history, or at least the dates that I have. Right. I mentioned the Yoruba villages already. All right, after Ilewa. All right, in 1995, we had the UNC winning the election, and we had not too long thereafter, the holidays were granted for the Shouter and Spiritual Baptists. All right, under the UNC. Not that I'm not political and I'm not trying to promote any party, so please forgive me. I'm just reciting the history. All right, in 1998, the National Council of Orisha Elders of Trinidad and Tobago was formed as an umbrella organization for the 33 registered shrines of Trinidad. All right, and this council, all right, of Orisha Elders is spelled O-R-I-S-H-A. All right, in 1999 was the passage of the Orisha Marriage Act of Trinidad and Tobago. All right. And also in 1999, Trinidad hosted the meeting of the 6th World Congress of Orisha Tradition. Also in 1999, Ella Andel released her first Orisha song CD, which was entitled Oriki Ogun. All right. And that is the extent of the history that I wished to share with everyone so that we would be aware of the relation between the history of the African culturally, religiously, and the Orisha community. Many of the activities that took place in Trinidad that brought about important social changes for African people were heavily supported by the Orisha community, and many of them came directly out of the Orisha yards, including the Pansides, including a lot of the unions. All right? That, we could study that for a long time because I was involved in the union and I'm fully aware of the history. And many of the players in the labor movement in Trinidad who were practitioners of Orisha. All right, from the very beginning of the labor movement. All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit, go back and speak a little bit. I'm going to read it too, but I just want to say and read this particular quotation from Iya Lorisha Melvina Rodney, who was popularly known as Iya Bogbo. All right. Her full name was Elizabeth Melvina Rodney. All right. She was interviewed at one point on the show that was called, what was the name of the show? Gael. She was interviewed by Aaron Hall, Sprangalang's brother. And the question he asked her on the interview was, what do you think the Orisha religion have to say or offer Trinidad and Tobago? And I'm going to read her response to the question. And I'm hoping that all of the members of the African community and of the Orisa community would pay attention to Iyabugbo's response. Because Iyabugbo was entrusted with the responsibility of Orisa affairs by the then Oni of Ife. She was also instrumental in creating an umbrella organization for all of the shrines in Trinidad. This is what her response was to the question. She said, well, at least I feel it has a lot. If our people would just try to get ourselves together, Orisa work should be our people should have love. The more the things that get us apart is no love. We should have love and unite together because everybody is one. I believe in love, love, love. End of quote. Now, to all the members of our community, I want to say this. Iya Melvina Rodney believed that we should get together, that we need to get ourselves together. She also believed that our people should have love for each other. She also mentioned uniting because we are all one. But that was her rationale. And we should believe in the virtue of love. All right? Now, I don't want to go down the road of etymology at this stage in the program, but I want to say that the word together means, when the etymology is broken down, to gather. So even though together is one word, when you check the etymology, you're going to see it means to gather. And the idea and the concept behind gathering is to form one body, or to form one company, or to have fellowship, or to associate with each other. All right? So now I am going to read from this book. The name of the book is Obia, Orisa, and Religious Identification or Identity in Trinidad. All right? Because this book has a lot of information concerning some of the things that are being discussed in many quarters at this time. All right? So it is important for us to know these aspects of our own history. All right? If the 1970s marked the explosion of Black nationalist ideologies in Trinidad, the 1980s attached institutional power and public influence to that consciousness. This decade unveiled the civic realm as a new theater of operation for Orisa devotees, who were staging an unprecedented appearance of African religious cultures in public arenas. Determined to keep the personal, political, some of the new Orisa devotees aligned their activism with Trinidad African nations' historical struggle for religious freedom within the judiciary and the parliament, and created the condition for African religious cultures to have their days in court unlike any before. Although the perception of African religion as numinemic obia had remained distorted within the new republic's collective memory, nothing less than a civic rights agenda of securing religious freedom brought institutional credibility and national recognition to the image of African religions as Orisa. By the 1980s, it appeared that the right combination of local and global events, such as the founding of the internationally constituted Orisa World Congress in 1981, had finally created the conditions for the re-valuation of the African religious heritage in Trinidad. The Yoruba Orisa tradition was uniquely positioned to symbolize that heritage and profit from a legacy of struggle for religious freedom and the protection of African religions under the law of Trinidad and Tobago. The signature event was the passing of the 1981 Act for the incorporation of the Orisa movement of Trinidad and Tobago, Egbe Orisa Ilewa, a Yoruba Orisa group governed by Iya Melvina Rodney. The purpose of this act was to provide protection and government sponsorship for Orisa shrines as adherents sought to standardize their devotional practices and organize their activities within formal institutional structures. Under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture, the Orisa community was empowered to develop archival material. Well, I read this before, so I will just skip ahead. After 1981, under the jurisdiction of a new republic, the government focus shifted from the eradication to the inclusion and education, and the Orisa community worked to remake its image through individual and corporate endeavors of national significance. Through Iya Melvina Rodney, modernist and matricentricity leadership, because the first representative Orisa community to play a pioneering role in the tradition's formative period of institutionalization. All right, and then they go on to talk about the registration of the Opa Orisa Shango, which I've already mentioned. All right, so I'm skipping ahead again. All right, authorized by the most senior Yoruba religious leader worldwide, Nigeria's Oni of Ife, Iya Rodney, position of authority over Orisa affairs in Trinidad and Tobago, was accepted within the global Yoruba Orisa community, reportedly based on her age and wisdom. Iya Orisa Melvina Rodney was the Oni's person of choice. She was a spiritual descendant of the legendary Orisa leader Elliot Ebenezer Paniza, and by extension, his renowned predecessor Ma Diamond, who I mentioned earlier, who said her grandparents came from West Africa, from Nigeria, who reportedly was born in Africa. That's what this book says, right? But as I mentioned before, who reportedly was born in Africa. Rodney was also the spiritual mother of hundreds of devotees in Trinidad and North America, many of whom made pilgrimage to her home for spiritual guidance and renewal and for personal and communal religious observances. Just 7 years after the EOIW, which is Ilewa, incorporation, the spiritual head of the Yoruba religion, the Oni, Okunade, Sijuwade, Oluboshe II, did indeed honor the nation of Trinidad and the Orisa community in particular, with the 8-day visit from July 31st to August 18, 1988, concurring with the Emancipation Week. The invitation was much more than a simple extension of hospitality. As the titular head of the Yoruba people, the Oni's visit symbolized a new era in Orisa religious formation in Trinidad. His presence not only elevated the esteemed position of the religion among its adherents, but also supplied the missing link between what some has come to dismiss as either primitive or invented heritage in Trinidad. The Oni was well received among Orisa devotees, and reports from Trinidad, 2 leading newspapers tracked his movements throughout the week as he graced prominent Orisa shrines, attended local Orisa feasts and cultural events, and participated in a nationally televised Orisa ceremony held in Port of Spain at the National Stadium on August 1st, Emancipation Day. The recognition given to Trinidadian expression of Yoruba religion transferred its public image, even if marginally, and imbued its members with the confidence and commitment to formalize Orisa legacy in Trinidad and Tobago as a local African religion with global analogies across the Atlantic world. The Oni himself was allegedly the first to voice the idea of organizing an institutionalized body to establish and nurture an efficient infrastructure based on the Orisa devotees of Trinidad and Tobago of lasting significance. However, was the Oni's selection of a woman as the spiritual head of the Orisa practitioners throughout the nation. After the Oni's visit, initial attempts to found a national council of Orisa elders resulted in the formation of an umbrella organization of 33 registered Orisa shrines. Its purpose, according to Gibbons, a chief spokesperson during the organization's formative years, was to establish a group that would be tolerant of difference and nonetheless establish the necessary standards that were required by the people themselves and the kind of public profile that would give the tradition a sense of social respect without having necessarily to change itself. Governed by an official board of directors of 6 Orisa elders. The National Council of Orisa Elders was incorporated in 1998, Iya Rodney, being at the apex of the governing structure, was responsible for selecting, via spiritual divination, the 5 additional board members, who were leaders of the Orisa shrines, the spiritual leaders of initiated children, knowledgeable about the tradition, and esteemed as having good, solid social reputation or good standing in society. Each of these 5 members, Sam Phils, Clarence Ford, Sylvestine de Gonzalez, Arthur Monsigi, and Eudora Thomas, were distinguished Orisa elders who were expected to hold lifetime positions and to demit office upon death or voluntarily or upon request by the spiritual elders only. In addition to the leadership of these 6 elders, the National Council of Orisa Elders membership structure included administrative, personnel, and a national body encompassing the head of registered shrines. The National Council of Orisa Elders' approach to leadership compelled the recognition of women's authority over policy and wider governance protocols during the Orisa tradition period of post-independence institutionalization, establishing a precedent to recover should patriarchal convention creep into the institution in the future. Women's effort to organize a loosely affiliated yet decentralized Yoruba Orisha community were painstaking and deliberate with regards to policy making and enforcement. Under Iya Rodney's leadership, the National Council of Orisha Elders operationalized governance procedures and standardized some conventions. Modifications were important as the Orisha tradition transitioned from a marginalized and misunderstood subculture to an official religion. As Gibbons notes, certainly when one is dealing with other bodies, be it the state, private sector, or international organizations, rather than we have 2 or 3 different voices talking, you need some standards in that respect. There have to be broad areas of agreement, and that was what was intended in establishing the council. The National Council of Orisha Elders' substantial collection of correspondence and documents indicate the level of consideration it gave not only to administrative efficiency, but also to standardizing ethical norms and protocol pertaining to ceremonial and ritual life. One of the first administrative tasks the board of directors tackled was documenting the number of operative shrines throughout the nation and making the wider Orisha community aware of the aims and objectives of the newly formed organization. It first established an official registration process allowing shrines to become active members of the National Council of Orisha Elders for a fee of $130. The registration form recorded relevant information, the shrine's patron deity, its period of ebb, which is considered to be most sacrosanct ritual among the Orisha devotees, other religious festivals observed, and community or educational activities. The council also established general rules and regulations for its leadership and the wider membership. Elders of the Orisha Council were expected to be role models for the community, particularly the youth and children, and behavior inimical to the aspiration of the Orisha community elicit severe sanctions. Notably, criminality as determined by the legal system of Trinidad and Tobago, public intoxication or similar forms of immorality, abuse of office including neglect of duty and divulging the business of the council, disrespect of or to other members, aggressive conduct towards other members, disrespect of other Orisha shrines, refusal to carry out directions of the assembly meetings where sanctions excluding expulsion were imposed. The ultimate authority to reprimand any shrine which does not support its program for the training of elders, drummers, singers, ritual officers, marriage officers, also rested with the council. Emphasis on respect and dignity has been the impetus behind the various reparations, rights, and public acknowledgement of the National Council of Orisa Elders has exacted from the national government with measurable success. For example, little time passed between the National Council of Orisa Elders Incorporation and its launching of a program designed to dismantle the disparaging narrative of the Orisa presence in Trinidad and the discriminatory practices that restricted the National Council of Orisa Elders' influence over national culture and civic life. The council immediately established a campaign to portray Yoruba Orisa as a valid religious tradition deserving of the status and legal rights and respect conferred on other recognized religious bodies in Trinidad and Tobago, in public and in the private domain. 2 years after its incorporation, the National Council of Orisa Elders issued 2 communiques on May 24, 2000 on the subject of religious freedom and legitimization. One was directed towards the Omo Orisa but sent a clear message to the external audience as well. It specifically indicated the National Council of Orisa Elders' vigilance in challenging the exclusionary policies of the national government. All right. Now, and the 2 correspondences are written here. All right. I'm going to read them, and then that is going to be it for this particular subject. I'm going to read something also concerning the inclusion of the Orisa community in the interreligious organization of Trinidad, even before it was called that. The Council of Orisa Elders of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to bring to the attention of all Orisa devotees the gross disrespect still being perpetrated on Orisa people by the current census being taken by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. There is still no listing of the Orisa faith in Trinidad and Tobago. We are still other. All Orisa people are advised not to sign under other in the area reserved for religion. That is to be crossed out and Orisa written in. It is time to insist that this ancient belief system of our ancestors and one of the oldest existing in the world be recognized. Declare yourself proudly as Orisa and insist that you be given the recognition and respect that we deserve. That was one communication. The second communication addresses fraudulent priests. The information the public of the National Council of Orisa Elders function as the official legitimizing structure of the Orisa tradition. The National Council of the Orisa Elders wish to state that there are umbrella bodies in Trinidad and Tobago which have shrines registered with them. These are Egbe Orisa Ilewa, the organization headed by Iyal Orisa Melvina Rodney. There is Opa Orisa Shango, headed by Babel Orisa Clarence Ford and Iyal Orisa Moliaihe. There is also the National Council of Orisa Elders, an incorporated body that brings together both Egbe Orisa Ilewa and Opa Orisa Shango. The members of the public are advised that not anyone declaring himself or herself an Orisa priest must be taken at their word. People are urged to make contact with any of these bodies or persons for verification. This is an ancient belief system. It is time that the disrespect and gullibility of people come to an end. Hear this part. The religion is properly documented and structured. Information is plentiful and available in libraries and bookshops and on the internet. Let us respect ourselves and this ancient sacred science. That is the second communication. All right, so now I'm going to skip over and I'm going to read a little bit about the entry of the Orisa community into the interreligious organizations. All right? And I want to read it directly from this book again, Obia, Orisa, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, because I don't want it to be that I say. I'm reading. All right? Now, this is page 171. All right? Orisa Ento Pearl Springer. TNT Interreligious Organization is an ecumenical constituency with long-standing representatives from the four major religious groups in Trinidad: Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, Hinduism, and Islam. Since its inception in 1972, other religious groups, such as the Spiritual Baptists and Baha'i, have entered the IRO, broadening its representation and diversifying its voice. Yet it had resisted inclusion of Yoruba Orisa community. It was the IRSC, a forerunner of the IRO, that in April 23rd, 1970, expressly neglected to include the Yoruba Orisa community when it penned a passionate and prayerful interreligious plea for peace and unity during the heights of social tension in the Black Power movement. For decades, the IRO was one of the NCOE's greatest obstacles, preventing its full access to public discourse and depriving it of opportunities to influence civic and national affairs. In her capacity as the National Council of Orisa Elders Public Relations Officer, Iya Ento Pearl Springer succeeded in having the council represented in the IRO, which led to a wider public and national stage for Orisa participation in the shaping of civil society and in national conversations concerning the role of religion in public life. The IRO aids and advises the government on religious matters and is the institution the government approaches when seeking religious officials to lead prayers at parliamentary meetings, diplomatic events, and other auspicious occasions. Although the IRO remains an independent group, it receives government funds for its initiatives and has easy access to national and local politicians. Thus, gaining membership in the IRO was a noteworthy accomplishment. All right, so we must give a lot of thanks to the elder who is still alive, Ento Pearl Springer, for her efforts and for eventually succeeding in getting our community to sit in that important position among the IRO. All right, let me read just a little more. The founding director of Trinidad and Tobago Heritage Library in 1993, Springer was a masterful tactician with the perfect blend of skills and political savvy to secure the National Council of Orisa Elders' desired results. She initiated an application for the IRO membership on behalf of the National Council of Orisa Elders in 1995, only to meet with 6 years of embittered exchanges and dismissal on the part of the organization. As she told it in 2000, it's been a fight. It's been a fight, she continued. And in fact, that I did a couple years ago, we linked with the Mahasabha, the most powerful Hindu organization, in a protest march in the streets. And we said, if by so and so and so and so time there was not an Orisa member on the IRO, Hindus, and Orisa people will come together and form our own interreligious organization. Folks, listen to these words. We sent several correspondences to the IRO requesting membership status, and there are letters to the press backward and forward. Listen, the IRO did not lobby the government for us to come on. We had to lobby against them because they were dominated and controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. So now, since 2001, Orisa has a full presence there with equal power. We have picketed the parliament, and with our drums, we circled Woodford Square with our drums, and it's just been a few of us. Today, the fruits of Springer's persistence in petitioning for the National Council of Orisa Elders membership can be seen at the IRO executive level, where Baba Neil Ryan Rawlins recently served as the IRO secretary from 2017 to 2018 on a leadership team of 10. All right. With that fiery reading, again, we need to thank Elder Ento Springer for her hard work and her persistence on behalf of the Orisa Council of Elders. So I think it's time now for me to close. And I want to read the words of Iya Bogbo Elizabeth Melvina Rodney that she gave at the interview. A response when asked, "What do you think the Orisa religion have to say or offer Trinidad and Tobago?" Her response was, "Well, at least I feel it has a lot. If our people will just try to get ourselves together, Orisa work should be our people should have love. The more the thing that gets us apart is no love. We should have love and unite together because it's everybody is one. I believe in love." Okay, folks, whatever happens, we are a community of people. We are one. She's absolutely correct. Look at the history. We came as many different groups. But over the years, our blood has mingled with each other. So in reality, we are in fact one. She's absolutely 100% correct. We need to put ourselves together. We need to get united. And our people should have love. Right? We should unite because we are one. And we should believe in the virtues of love. All right, with that, I would like to say, you do good for yourself. You do bad for yourself. All right, and next week, what I promised this week would be delivered next week. Our discussion next week is going to be on building sustainable communities. All right, Udabo, and see you next week.